The oil lamp flickered in the small, dim room, casting long shadows on the walls. Thomas Mercer's trembling hand gripped the land deed as if it might slip away, taking his final hopes with it. He turned his fading gaze toward Alfred Cole, who stood stiffly in the doorway, his face hardened by years of hard work, but his eyes clouded with confusion. "You want this ranch, Cole?" Thomas rasped, his voice rough with death. "Then you marry my daughter at dawn." Alfred's mind whirled as he glanced past Thomas, toward the quiet room where Alia Mercer, Thomas's daughter, slept. Beautiful, strong-willed, proud. He had spent years watching her from a distance, seeing the way she carried herself, the way she managed the ranch's accounts and ran the operation. He had never imagined that he might one day find himself in her bed, or worse, forced into marriage with her. But the ranch, the 1,000 acres that stretched across the valley, was all Alfred had ever wanted. He had worked for others all his life, never owning a piece of land that could be his own. But at what cost? Thomas coughed, a wet, painful sound that echoed in the still room. 5 hours, he wheezed. Sunrise in 5 hours. Creditors come Monday. Decide now, or the railroad takes everything. My daughter, my land, all gone. Alfred's hands shook. He wanted the land. He needed it. Without it, he was just another drifter, another nameless man working someone else's land, hoping for a break that might never come. But this was something he never expected. Marriage to a woman he barely knew, someone who would never want him, who would despise him for the rest of his life. How could he ask her to marry him, knowing she'd hate him? And yet, without the land, she too would be ruined, left with nothing but the streets and the shame of losing it all. "Why don't?" Alfred whispered, his voice tight with fear. Thomas smiled grimly, but it was more a grimace than anything else. "Because I'll be dead by Tuesday, and this needs to be legal before I go." Alfred stood there, staring at the man who had built this ranch from the ground up, watching as he bled out before his eyes. The weight of Thomas's words settled over him like a heavy blanket. "I'll do it," Alfred said after a long, agonizing silence. "But she has to agree. It can't be forced." Thomas nodded weakly, his eyes flickering with something close to relief. "She will. She's practical, like her mother." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll give her a choice afterward. But for now, it's the only way." The truth of it hit Alfred like a slap. He wasn't doing this for love. He wasn't even doing it for her. He was doing it for the land, for the legacy he could never create on his own. "And when you're gone?" Alfred asked, his voice trembling. "When you pass, I'll give her the freedom to leave. But I'll keep my word." Thomas's gaze softened. "You're more honorable than I gave you credit for, Cole." Alfred nodded stiffly, the lump in his throat tightening. He didn't feel honorable. He felt like a coward. But he would do it. He would marry her, give her the ranch, and when the time came, let her go. As Alfred turned to leave, Thomas's voice stopped him. "Wake her. Tell her. Let her decide." Alfred's stomach churned. Breaking this news would shatter her world. He wasn't sure if he could do it, but he knew he had no choice. The clock was ticking. The first rays of sunlight were still hours away, but already Alfred's mind was heavy with the weight of a decision he could never undo. Would Alia agree? What would she say when she found out? Could a forced marriage ever become something real? He didn't know, but as he stepped out into the cold night air, the questions gnawed at him, each one more painful than the last. Time was running out, and by dawn, everything would change. Alfred found the kitchen dark, save for the faint glow of a dying fire in the stove. The smell of coffee filled the room, and there, standing by the counter, was Alia. She was already awake, her face pale with exhaustion from a week of nursing her father through his final days. She didn't look up at first, too focused on the cup she was filling. But when Alfred stepped in, his boots creaking softly on the floorboards, she glanced up in surprise. "Is Papa worse?" she asked, her voice gentle, betraying no hint of the turmoil she must have been feeling. Alfred couldn't meet her eyes. The words seemed to lodge in his throat, each one heavier than the last. Your father made me an offer, he said quietly. She frowned, setting the coffee pot down with a soft clink, a flicker of concern crossing her features. For the ranch, she asked, and Alfred nodded. She sighed in relief, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Thank God, she murmured. The creditors, I thought it was too late. But before she could finish, Alfred's words interrupted her, cold and sharp. There's a condition, Miss Mercer. She stopped, the smile slipping from her face as she stared at him, confusion darkening her expression. Alfred hesitated, but the weight of it, the weight of what he was about to say, felt like a stone lodged deep in his chest. Marriage at dawn, he said, each word tasting bitter on his tongue. Alia's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him as if he had struck her. Her hands trembled, the coffee cup slipping from her grasp and shattering on the floor. She didn't seem to notice. He sold me. Her voice was a mix of disbelief and anger, her eyes wide with a hurt Alfred hadn't anticipated. Like livestock. Alfred winced at the accusation, his heart aching. He's trying to save you from destitution, he said, his voice hoarse, though it didn't sound convincing, even to him. Alia ran, her feet pounding across the floor as she rushed to her father's room. Alfred stood frozen, watching her retreating form, knowing that nothing he could say would make this any easier. He had never been one to lie, but this was a lie they both had to live. Inside the room, Thomas lay in bed, his breathing shallow and strained. Alia was kneeling at his side, her face contorted in fury, her voice trembling as she confronted her father. How could you? She demanded, her hands gripping the edge of his bed. I'm not property. Thomas, barely conscious, lifted his hand, weak and shaking, to gesture for her to come closer. You think any man takes a debt-ridden ranch without a guarantee? His voice was cracked, strained. You think I'd leave you with nothing? Without a way to survive? Without a future? His words were ragged, but there was a desperation in them that Alia couldn't ignore. I won't do it, she screamed, her chest heaving with anger. I won't let you sell me like that. Thomas's eyes filled with a deep sadness as he took her hand, squeezing it with all the strength he had left. Then you lose everything, he whispered, the words carrying a painful finality. The streets by Tuesday. Is your pride worth that? The anger drained from Alia's face, leaving only the hollow ache of grief. She looked at her father, the man who had raised her, the man who had always fought for her, and saw the devastation in his eyes. I'm forcing you to survive, he said softly. Hate me if you must, but live, Alia. She broke then, her anger faltering as the weight of the reality set in. She dropped her head, her body trembling with silent sobs. It was then that Alfred appeared in the doorway. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic as he spoke, but his words were firm. I'll give you your freedom after, he said. When your father's gone, I'll have legal papers drawn up. You'll be free to leave. She turned to him, eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and betrayal, as though the very mention of freedom was an insult now. Alfred's stomach twisted with the weight of it all. He wasn't offering her love. He wasn't offering her anything but a promise of survival. You're trapped, he thought. We're both trapped. The thought of being bound to this woman, this stranger, in a marriage that would never be real, filled him with dread. But he had made a choice. He had promised Thomas. We'll survive this, he whispered to her. She stared at him, her eyes fierce, but there was something deeper in them now, something that echoed her own desperation. And what about you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alfred didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure if he even cared anymore. The dawn was coming. You'll marry me, he said softly, because there's no other choice. And when your father is gone, you can leave. You'll have that choice, Alia. But until then, we do this. She stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. You swear it's only survival? No more, no less. Alfred swallowed hard. I swear it. And for the first time since he'd entered that room, Alfred felt the crushing weight of the decision he had made. There was no turning back now. Alia nodded stiffly, then turned away to help her father, leaving Alfred standing in the doorway, haunted by the hollow promise he had made. The soft light of early morning broke through the bedroom window as Alia stood before the mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted the lace veil that had once belonged to her mother. The wedding dress was preserved, wrapped in layers of silk, a reminder of a love story long gone. It wasn't her dress, but it would have to do. As she stared at her reflection, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The veil felt heavy, suffocating, like the weight of everything she had lost in the last few days. She had always imagined her wedding day would be filled with joy, with love. Not this. This forced union to a stranger, a man she barely knew and had just learned to despise. Her mother's face flashed in the mirror, the memory of her soft smile, the way she had always dreamed of her daughter's future. But Alia's future was slipping through her fingers, snatched away by the same man who had raised her and who now lay dying in the other room, too weak to even attend his own daughter's wedding. Alia's fingers trembled as she adjusted the veil one last time, her eyes drifting to the small chest of drawers where her mother's perfume still lingered, the scent of jasmine reminding her of a time when life had been simple, before the weight of survival had become her only concern. Meanwhile, Alfred was outside, standing by the horse trough, his rough hands working methodically as he shaved and washed the dirt from his face, preparing for a wedding that felt more like a prison sentence than a celebration. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, too, but there was no way out now. He couldn't back out. The ranch was his ticket to something real, something lasting, even if it meant marrying a woman who would never look at him the way a wife should. When he was done, he mended his shirt, the one he wore for special occasions, though the day hardly seemed special. His heart was heavy with the weight of his own desperation, but it was nothing compared to what Alia must be feeling. He had offered her freedom after her father's death, but would she believe him? Would she trust him? The ranch hand Jed, a sly and gossiping man, saw Alfred preparing to leave the barn and made his usual comment, his voice laced with mockery. "Marrying the boss's daughter? Clever move, Cole," he said, his grin wide with amusement. Alfred's jaw tightened, the tension in his body evident. "Mind your business, Jed," he snapped, not in the mood for jokes or insinuations. Jed's knowing smirk lingered, and Alfred couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was on the horizon. But there was no time to dwell on it now. He set off to find the preacher, the one Thomas had arranged to perform the ceremony. The preacher had arrived earlier, looking uncomfortable in his worn, dusty coat, but Alfred had paid him well enough, and the man wasn't about to turn down the fee. As Alfred made his way to the house, he couldn't help but feel the tension building in his chest. The sun was rising. The clock was ticking. Inside, Alia had finally emerged, her wedding dress a fragile testament to what she had once hoped for and what she had now lost. She stepped out onto the front porch, her back straight, her face an unreadable mask of resignation and grief. Alfred's breath caught in his throat when he saw her, standing there like a ghost, the sunlight catching the edges of her veil. She was beautiful, even more so than he had remembered, but her beauty only reminded him of how wrong this all felt. They stood in silence for a moment, neither knowing what to say or how to act. Alia's heart was pounding, her thoughts a blur of anger, hurt, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had she been reduced to this? Her father's plan had forced her into this situation, and Alfred, kind, honorable Alfred, had agreed. She could hardly look at him. She barely noticed the preacher as he stepped forward, mumbling something about getting this over with. But Alia's focus remained on her father, who was now being carried outside in a chair, wrapped in blankets, his eyes half-lidded and exhausted. He managed a weak smile when he saw her, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's done, Alia. You're protected now." She couldn't bring herself to look at him, and the preacher's voice broke through the thick air. "Do you, Alfred Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Alfred's voice was steady, though his heart thundered in his chest. "I do," he said, his words firm, even as his stomach churned. "Do you, Alia Mercer, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better or worse, until death do you part?" The pause was excruciating. Alia's eyes flickered to her father's face, his pleading eyes urging her to say yes, to endure the hardship. She bit back the anger that rose in her throat and, with barely a whisper, said, "I do." The preacher hurriedly muttered the words, and with a final, "reluctant by the power vested in me," the ceremony was over. Alfred reached out, but Alia turned quickly, walking away without a word, leaving him standing there, a man bound by law and circumstance. There was no kiss, no celebration, nothing but the cold finality of a marriage made in the shadow of death. As Alfred stood there, staring after her, he realized the enormity of what had just happened. She was his wife now, but they were strangers bound together by nothing more than the promises of a dying man. Later, when the sun was fully up, Alfred moved his things into the barn, his new home, while Alia returned to her father's side. It was the beginning of their new life, but it felt more like an ending. The land was his, but at what cost? The silence between them was suffocating. Their first day as man and wife had arrived, and neither of them knew how to live it. 5 days had passed since the wedding, and Thomas Mercer's decline was faster than anyone had anticipated. The once proud rancher, who had spent decades building his land and reputation, was now a mere shadow of his former self, reduced to a fragile, hollow version of the man he had been. His skin was pale, his breathing labored, and every moment seemed to drain the life from him, as if the very air around him was too thick for his lungs. Alia had barely left his side, her days consumed by the endless routine of caring for him. She bathed his face, fed him spoonfuls of broth, and spoke to him softly, though she knew he could barely hear her. The weight of grief and exhaustion pressed down on her, but she couldn't afford a break. Not yet, not while her father needed her. Meanwhile, Alfred had taken full responsibility for running the ranch, managing the cattle, fixing broken fences, and keeping the financial books in order. He spent long hours working, not out of a sense of duty to his new wife, but out of a desperate need to keep his mind occupied, to avoid confronting the reality of the situation. The land was his, but it came with a price he hadn't fully understood when he'd agreed to the marriage. He hadn't expected to feel so disconnected from Alia, from everything. She was a ghost in the house, and he was a stranger to her. The night was the only time they truly shared space, and even then, the silence between them was suffocating. Alfred often lay awake in the barn, staring at the rafters, thinking of the promises he had made. He had pledged to give Alia freedom when her father passed, but the words felt hollow. She had agreed to the marriage out of obligation, and every day that passed made it clear that nothing about their union was real, nothing but survival. It was a strange kind of loneliness being married but still feeling so isolated. One evening, Alfred brought the financial ledgers to Thomas's bedside, hoping to gain approval for the decisions he had made regarding the ranch. But the old man barely had the strength to hold his head up, and the words that came out of his mouth were more rasp than speech. "You'll take care of everything?" Thomas croaked, his hand trembling as it reached toward the papers. Alfred nodded, though he wasn't sure if Thomas could even see him. "Yes, sir. And your daughter. I gave my word." Thomas's eyes fluttered as he searched Alfred's face, trying to make sense of the man who had suddenly become so integral to his daughter's future. "She hates me now for forcing this." His voice was weak, but the sorrow in his words was clear. Alfred swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. "She loves you," he said softly. "That's why she agreed." It was a lie, but it was the best kind of lie. one that didn't sting as much as the truth. As if on cue, Alia entered the room, her eyes red from crying. She glanced at the two men, her gaze hardening when she saw them together. "Don't you dare bond over trading me," she said sharply, her voice full of venom, though her words felt like an attempt to hold on to something, anything, that still made sense. Thomas reached out weakly, his frail fingers brushing her arm. "I'm sorry, no choice, couldn't let you starve." His voice cracked, the sorrow in his eyes evident. She didn't reply, but the tears that welled up in her eyes betrayed her emotions. She wanted to hate him for this, for the choice he had made, but she knew, deep down, that he had done it out of love. It wasn't the kind of love that she had ever imagined, but it was love nonetheless. The next morning, Thomas's decline seemed even more pronounced. His breaths were ragged, and he barely moved, as though the act of existing had become too much for him. Alia sat beside him, her hand on his, whispering soft words of comfort, though she didn't know if he could hear. The ranch, which had once been full of life and purpose, now felt like an empty shell. It was just the two of them, Alfred and Alia, living in the same house, both of them trapped in their own worlds, neither willing to acknowledge the other. Alia had spent so much time caring for her father that she hadn't had a moment to think about the life she was now living. She had agreed to the marriage out of necessity, but the toll it had taken on her was beginning to show. She barely slept, barely ate, and when she did sleep, her dreams were full of confusion and anger. Alfred was a man she didn't know, a man she hadn't chosen, and yet here she was, married to him. She had tried to convince herself that it was the best way, the only way to ensure her future, but now, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to feel, the reality of it all was too much. She had once imagined that she would find love, a man who would cherish her and build a future with her. But now, that dream seemed like a far-off fantasy, something that belonged to another life, another version of herself. She sat by her father's bedside, clutching his hand, her heart breaking for the man who had raised her, for the man who was slipping away from her, and for herself, because she knew that when he was gone, she would have nothing left. She would be alone in a world that didn't care. That night, Thomas's breathing became more labored, and Alia knew, deep down, that the end was near. She had always been close to her father, but now, in his final moments, it felt as if they were worlds apart. She whispered words of love to him, though she wasn't sure he could hear, and held his hand tightly, praying that he wouldn't have to suffer for much longer. It was then that Alfred came into the room, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked at Alia for a moment, as if unsure of what to do or say, before he moved to her side. He didn't speak, just reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent offer of support. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at him either. It was as if they had both become ghosts in this house. Two people bound together by circumstances, but unable to find their way back to one another. The night stretched on, and with each passing hour, it became clearer that Thomas's time was running out. Alfred sat by the fire, his thoughts racing, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. The weight of it all, the promises he had made, the promises he hadn't kept, crushed him. And when the moment finally came, when Thomas's final breath left his body, Alia's anguished cry shattered the silence of the room. It was a sound that would haunt Alfred for the rest of his life. He rushed to her side, lifting her gently as she collapsed over her father's body, her sobs racking her frame. He held her, though he wasn't sure she wanted comfort or just the weight of someone else's presence. Her grief was a storm, and all he could do was weather it with her. As the night wore on, and the house fell into an eerie stillness, Alfred realized that this was the moment that would define them both. They had made it this far, but what now? When the sun rose, they would be alone, truly alone, for the first time since they had been married. The days following Thomas's death passed in a blur of numbness, the funeral behind them, and the ranch carrying on its usual rhythm of work and silence. But everything felt different. Alia barely left her room, lost in the grief of losing her father, while Alfred continued working the land with a quiet intensity, keeping to himself, rarely crossing her path. The house felt empty, as if the weight of Thomas's absence was too much for it to bear. Alia hadn't signed the annulment papers, the ones Alfred had placed on the kitchen table after the funeral, but they lingered there, a silent reminder of the life she was supposed to reclaim. Each time she glanced at the envelope, her chest tightened. She knew she could leave. The arrangement had always been clear, but the idea of signing those papers, of ending the marriage that had never felt like a real union, filled her with a strange kind of fear. She didn't know what would happen afterward. She didn't know what she wanted anymore. Alfred had made a promise to her father, a promise to let her go when he was gone, but Alia couldn't shake the feeling that it was too easy to let everything slip away, that this marriage, even though forced, still meant something, or at least it should. She wasn't sure. The silence between them was suffocating, each of them carrying their own burdens, neither willing to ask for what they truly needed. Alfred had been the one to take over Thomas's responsibilities, but he had done it without asking for anything in return. He had kept his distance from Alia, giving her space to mourn, but a part of him had hoped, foolishly, that they might find something more between them. After all, he had promised her father that she would have freedom, that she could leave when the time was right. But what if that time never came? What if they were stuck in this in-between place forever, living side by side, but never truly living together? It wasn't a marriage in the traditional sense, and Alia knew it. It had never been a union built on love, but the more time passed, the more she realized that there was a strange kind of connection between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive. She watched him from the window one evening as he worked in the fields, his back bent against the weight of the work, the sun setting behind him. He was a man of few words, but the way he carried himself, the way he cared for the ranch, it told her everything she needed to know. He was dependable, steady, and he didn't ask for much in return. That night, as the wind howled outside, Alia couldn't sleep. She rose from her bed, still in her morning dress, and made her way downstairs. She found Alfred in the kitchen, his back to her as he prepared a small meal. He didn't notice her approach until she cleared her throat, and then he turned, startled by her presence. The tension between them was thick, but she didn't know how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. "You didn't sign the papers," Alfred said quietly, his eyes flicking to the envelope on the table. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over and sat down at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the envelope. "I'm not ready," she said after a long pause. Alfred looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why not? It's what we agreed on, Alia. You don't owe me anything. You're free to go whenever you want." She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I want anymore." Alfred took a step closer, his gaze softening as he studied her. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to still be so conflicted after everything that had happened. "You're still grieving. I get it, but you don't have to stay here because of me." Alia met his eyes then, her expression unreadable. "I'm not staying because of you," she replied quietly, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "But maybe I should stay because of me." Alfred didn't know what to say to that. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken emotions, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Alfred spoke, his voice low but firm. "You can stay as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere." And then, to his surprise, she stood up and walked over to him, her steps measured but deliberate. She reached for his hand, her touch light but certain, and he looked down at her, not knowing what to expect. "I'm not asking for forever, Alfred," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to feel like I'm trapped in a cage anymore." Alfred's chest tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, The walls between them seemed to crack just a little. "Then don't," he said softly. "You don't have to feel trapped here. I will make you stay." Alia nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around his hand. "I know," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "But I think I need to figure out who I am before I make any decisions. And I don't know what that looks like yet." He squeezed her hand gently. "Take all the time you need, but know that I'm here for whatever you need." For the first time since the wedding, something shifted between them. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was a beginning. Alia felt something stir within her, a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in days. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew that she couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep mourning what was lost. She had to start living for herself, for her future, and whatever that future held, she was beginning to understand that it was okay to let Alfred be a part of it. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about living, truly living, and for the first time in a long while, Alia felt like she might have a chance at that. Days passed, and as the ranch continued to thrive under their combined effort, small changes began to take place. Alfred continued working alongside her, not out of duty, but because he wanted to. He fixed things around the house that had long been neglected, mended fences that had been broken, and made sure the cattle were fed and healthy. Alia watched him from the window sometimes, her heart softening as she saw him care for the land and for her. She had always thought of him as a stranger, but now, as she watched him with the horses, the ranch, the fields, she saw something different. She saw him as someone who understood the land in a way she never could, someone who had fought his whole life for something real, just as she had. Alfred wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. One evening, when the sky turned deep orange with the setting sun, Alia found herself standing beside him, watching the horizon stretch out before them. "You know," she said quietly, "I never really understood what it meant to take care of something, of someone, until now." Alfred turned to look at her, his face unreadable. "You're doing just fine," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're doing this together, Alia." And in that moment, she realized that for all the hurt, all the anger, all the confusion, they had come to an understanding. They were no longer two strangers tied together by circumstance. They were partners. They were learning to live together, to build something that was truly theirs. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time since her father's death, Alia felt the stirrings of hope. It wasn't love yet, but it was something worth holding on to. The thawing had begun. 3 weeks after the funeral, things were beginning to feel like they might change, though neither Alfred nor Alia was ready to admit out loud. The air between them had shifted subtly, like a tension loosening, but it was still fragile. Alia hadn't signed the annulment papers, and each time she looked at them, the finality of it all felt like a heavy weight she couldn't lift. She hadn't known what she wanted after Thomas's death, hadn't known what she was supposed to feel, but the more time passed, the more she realized that there was a quiet understanding between her and Alfred, something that had begun to grow without either of them intending it. Alfred had been true to his word. He didn't pressure her to sign the papers, didn't push her for anything more than she was willing to give. He kept his distance when she needed it and gave her space when she needed that too. But he had also been there for her in ways she hadn't expected, like the time he fixed the kitchen stove before she even asked, or the way he had stood by her side when the storm had hit, sharing his coat without saying a word. She hadn't expected that kind of tenderness from a man she barely knew. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was always with a sense of care, of duty, of responsibility. And it made her question everything she thought she knew about what it meant to be loved. One evening, after a long day of work, Alia found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with brilliant shades of pink and orange. She hadn't expected to find herself out here, hadn't expected the calm that had begun to settle over her, but it was there. The work had been hard, the days long, but they had become easier in some ways. She had started to look forward to the quiet evenings when they would sit together in the stillness, neither of them saying much, but the company itself enough to fill the emptiness. Alfred came out onto the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel, his face tired but calm. He stood next to her, looking out at the same sunset she had been watching. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though they both knew that something important was hanging in the balance, and the time to address it was coming. "Alfred," Alia said softly, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking." He glanced at her, his gaze steady. "About what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her cup. The weight of it all felt too heavy to carry, but she had to say it. "About the marriage," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "and what it really means." What should mean? He didn't interrupt her, didn't ask questions, or try to explain himself. He just stood there, watching her, waiting for her to continue. She felt his patience, his calm presence, and it made her realize something she hadn't been willing to admit before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing to live, choosing to find a way forward, even if that way was unclear. "I thought when we got married, it was just something to get through," she said quietly. "Something to survive. But now I'm not so sure." Alfred's brow furrowed, his expression shifting from calm to curious. "Not sure about what?" She turned to him then, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in weeks. "Not sure about whether I should leave," she said. "Not sure about whether I should stay. But I know one thing for certain. I don't want to live in limbo anymore. I don't want to keep pretending that this is just a temporary thing." Her heart was racing as she spoke, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Alfred's silence stretched out, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what he was thinking. But then, slowly, he turned toward her, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to decide today," he said softly. "You don't have to choose anything right now." Alia shook her head, frustration rising within her. "I can't keep pretending that nothing has changed. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something more than just survival." She stopped herself, her words hanging in the air like an unsaid confession. Alfred's expression softened. He stepped closer, the space between them closing, but he didn't touch her, didn't crowd her. "You're not alone in this, Alia," he said quietly. "You never have been. I've been here. I've stayed." She nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. The time had come to confront what they both had been avoiding. The quiet space between them that had been filled with unspoken understanding, with small gestures of kindness, but nothing more. She had known from the beginning that this marriage wasn't built on love. It was a contract, a deal, a survival mechanism. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted, and now, standing here with him, she realized that the possibility of something more was there, something that neither of them had expected but both had needed. "I don't know if I can love you, Alfred," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I think I can try. I want to try." His eyes softened, a flicker of something deep and vulnerable passing through them. "I don't know if I can love you either, Alia," he admitted, "but I've stayed for a reason, and that reason hasn't changed. I think we can figure this out. Together." The air between them shifted once again, this time warmer, more certain. It wasn't love yet, not in the way she had once dreamed of it, but it was something real, something worth pursuing. They stood there in silence for a moment, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the land they had both come to care for. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real. It was theirs. "I don't want to be the woman who runs away from everything," Alia said quietly. "I don't want to live in fear anymore." Alfred nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Then don't," he said simply. "Stay because you want to. Stay because this is where you belong." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She was ready to make a choice. She was ready to take the next step. Then I'll stay, she said, her voice firm with conviction. I'll stay and I'll try. I'll try to be more than just a woman who survived. I'll try to be the woman who chooses to live, chooses to build something real. Alfred smiled, the warmth in his eyes finally reaching the depths of his heart. And I'll be here every step of the way, he promised, no matter what. And in that moment, Alia realized that they were no longer two strangers bound by obligation. They were two people choosing to be together, choosing to make something of this life they had been given. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs, and that was enough. They had both made their choice, and that was where everything began. The morning after their quiet conversation on the porch, Alia woke early, as she had done for weeks now. The sunlight filtered softly through the window, casting a golden glow on the worn floorboards of the bedroom. She lay still for a moment, breathing in the unfamiliar sense of calm that surrounded her. The bed felt different today. The weight of the past, the weight of her father's death, of the choices she had made, and the decisions yet to come, felt somehow lighter. The space between her and Alfred had shifted. Something new and fragile had taken root. For the first time since she'd agreed to marry him, Alia felt as though there was something worth holding on to, something real. She turned her head to see Alfred lying beside her, his strong form turned toward her, his face softened in sleep. He was always the first to rise, and she knew that soon he would be up, quietly tending to the ranch, as he had done every morning since Thomas had passed. But today, there was a different sense of possibility in the air, and for the first time, Alia didn't feel as if she were simply surviving. She felt like she might be truly living. Alfred woke soon after, his usual morning routine steady and familiar. He turned toward her, blinking in the soft light. His gaze was steady and warm, something unspoken passing between them. "Morning, wife," he said with a smile that seemed to speak of more than just the formalities of their marriage. Alia returned the smile, though it was softer, more genuine than it had been before. "Morning, husband," she whispered. The words didn't feel like a trap today. They felt like a promise. They got up, shared a quiet breakfast, and then went about their day side by side, as they had for the last few weeks. But today, there was something different in their easy silence. It wasn't the forced silence of two people trapped in a marriage of convenience, but the comfortable quiet of two people choosing to be together. After breakfast, Alfred went out to check the fence line, and Alia followed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose in the rhythm of the work. They spoke little, but there was a calm understanding between them. As they worked, their hands brushing occasionally, the space between them felt more natural. It wasn't love yet, not the sweeping, consuming kind that she had once imagined for herself, but it was something that had begun to grow, something steady, something reliable. They had spent enough time together now to see the cracks in each other's facades, to see the parts of themselves that had been hidden in the silence. But they had learned to accept those parts, had learned to forgive each other for the past and for the fears they had carried. It was a slow, quiet transformation, and yet it was undeniable. Alia knew that this wasn't the fairy tale romance she had once dreamt of. There was no sweeping declaration of love, no grand gesture. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the way they had learned to care for each other, the way they had found a shared sense of purpose in the ranch, in their daily lives, and in the small moments they shared. In the afternoon, after the fence had been repaired and the cattle were fed, Alia found herself alone in the barn, sorting through the remaining tools that had been left behind by Thomas. She was lost in thought when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Alfred. His presence was always steady, grounding her in a way that she hadn't known she needed until now. "How's the barn coming along?" he asked, his voice low and easy. She smiled faintly. "Getting there. Slowly, but it's coming together." Alfred leaned against the doorframe, his gaze thoughtful as he watched her work. "You're doing a good job," he said quietly. "I don't say it often enough, but I notice all of it. Everything you've done since we've been here." She paused, her fingers stilling over the tools in her hand. His words were simple, but they held weight. She hadn't expected to hear them. She hadn't expected him to notice at all. Alia turned toward him, her eyes meeting his. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her heart race, something deeper than the casual affection they had shared in the past weeks. She knew, suddenly, that it was there, something she hadn't been able to name, something that had slowly grown between them. She wasn't sure if it was love, but it was more than just survival. It was something real, something that mattered. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice catching. He nodded, but there was a quiet understanding in his gaze. He didn't say anything more. The moment lingered, comfortable and familiar, but heavy with the unspoken truth that neither of them had been willing to confront until now. Alia had been so determined to keep her distance, to hold on to the idea that this marriage was only a matter of survival, but now she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure what would come next or what this meant for them, but she knew that whatever it was something they would face together. As the days passed, the thaw between them deepened. They worked side by side in silence, each of them growing more comfortable in their presence, more willing to let down the walls that had once divided them. It wasn't without its struggles. There were moments of tension, of old wounds resurfacing, but they had learned to navigate those moments with patience, with understanding. And through it all, there was a quiet hope between them, a shared belief that they could build something out of the wreckage of their past. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the landscape with shades of orange and purple, Alia found herself standing beside Alfred again, the two of them gazing out at the land they had come to share. There were no words between them, just the soft hum of evening, the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the shared sense of purpose that had become a constant presence in their lives. For a long time, they stood in silence, and Alia realized that in those quiet moments, she had come to understand something profound. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't the woman who had lost everything. She was the woman who had chosen, who had decided to move forward, to rebuild, and to find a way to make this life hers. She had made peace with the fact that this wasn't the life she had planned for, but it was a life she could live. And Alfred, despite everything, despite the awkwardness of their beginnings, despite the challenges they had faced, was someone she could build that life with. She had been so afraid of losing herself in this marriage, so afraid of giving up the idea of what her life should have been, that she hadn't allowed herself to see what she had been given. She had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to create something real, to find something she had never expected. Alfred glanced at her, his expression softening, as though he had come to the same realization. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd be standing here like this with you, but I'm glad I am." She smiled at him, the weight of everything that had come before them, everything they had survived, lifting just a little. "So am I," she whispered. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alia allowed herself to believe that this could be enough, that they could be enough. That together, they could build a life that was more than just survival. It wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. And that, in the end, was enough. As the night settled in, Alfred took her hand, and together they walked back toward the house, side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. This was their beginning, their becoming. The past was gone, but the future was theirs to choose. And that was the only certainty they needed.